Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel, which is chronicling the restoration of my beloved Powell's 46 International Fast Cruiser. I've had Dreamfinder for coming up 14 years now, and in that time we've done a lot of work. 8 years ago she was re-engined, and we spent quite a while sorting out niggly issues with speed and overheating. As part of the re-engineering, we had to rip out the bench seating in the saloon, so the saloon's been retrimmed and custom seating has been made. The autopilot was a Heath Robinson affair that didn't work, so that has now been replaced. And 4 years ago, the hull was gel peeled and copper coated. Problems with earth bonding have seen us replacing the props. And then in June of 2020, we sailed her 540 miles from Southampton round to Fleetwood on the Fylde coast in the Irish Sea. We hit a force 6 in Cardigan Bay on our journey round and limped into Holyhead with our dive platform hanging off and one of the bilge pumps permanently on. On arrival in Fleetwood, this dive platform has now been repaired and I'm ready to tackle the major project of repairing the rear deck and refitting the back cabin. It is Friday the 8th of January and the UK has just entered into a national lockdown, so that presents a little bit of a problem because we're not quite sure what is allowed, what is not allowed in terms of travel. So it's going to be a little bit interesting, but there's still lots of things I can show you. So I'm going to go through what we've done in terms of re-engineering Dreamfinders today. There's a little bit of research to do in terms of where Dreamfinder is going to go to get her onto hard standing and undercover. So we'll cover that sort of thing. Okay, so hopefully you'll enjoy this video, and yeah, let's see how we go. So we're talking about 8 years ago now. We'd had a disastrous season. We'd been from Portishead to Swansea. We had some guests on board. They had to get back for a particular time, so we were actually coming back from Swansea on the Saturday, and we were punching the tide because they had to get back for a specific time. And we got about, I would say, a third of the way back from Swansea, and all of a sudden the engines lost power. We literally just stopped, and clouds of black smoke coming out the back of the boat, and yeah, not pleasant. So I throttled back, we dropped the anchor so we could take a look and see what was going on. And what seemed to be happening, there was no fire, but what seemed to be happening is whenever we got to a point where the turbos kicked in, the engines would die and black smoke would start billowing out the back of the boat. So it's obviously something to do with turbos or something. So what I worked out is that I could run the port engine up to full power without any problems, but the starboard engine, as soon as the turbo kicked in, both engines died. So we ran back to Cardiff on the port engine, and we arrived at Cardiff to get into the lock at the very last lock of low tide. So it was scary, to say the least. Anyway, we got in to Cardiff and moored up, took a look on in the engine room and realised that what had happened is the exhaust elbow on the starboard engine had sheared, and all of the exhaust was actually venting into the engine room, and it had covered everything with this like black soot. So we wired the exhaust elbow back together, and we filled it with exhaust gunk just to get us back into Portishead, and the engineer at Portishead welded the exhaust elbow back together and refitted it. So the next trip out was to Watchet, and we stayed overnight in Watchet. We were with another boat, started to come back from Watchet, and all of a sudden I lost throttles. No idea what was going on or why, but the throttles just weren't working. So we limped back into Portishead on gears. We couldn't make more than 7 knots, and in fact we couldn't slow down either, so we were running at 7 knots whether we liked it or not. And the only way of actually stopping the boat was to actually turn the engines off, and then put it into reverse and turn them back on. So again, a little bit scary, and at that point, yeah, things were starting to get a little bit hairy with the other half. Turned out that when the exhaust elbow had sheared, it had also punched a hole through a flexible hose, and the exhaust gases were now venting through this little hole straight onto the hydraulics, and they burned through the hydraulics. So we got the hydraulics fixed, took her out for a bit of a sea trial, and it was quite choppy but quite nice. And next thing you know, we've got little dwarfs with sledgehammers knocking on the engine, and we'd bent a cam follower. So at this point, I got an ultimatum: fix those damned engines, or I'm not coming back on the boat. Looking at the cost of new engines, it was astronomical. I mean, one Volvo engine would be £26,000 plus fitting, and I needed two of them. So she sat for a couple of years, basically, while I sulked and worked out what to do next. And in the end, I decided I've got to do something, but I couldn't afford new engines. So I started asking around on the forums for an engineer who would be able to do the work, and recommendations on what engines to get second hand. And this guy on the motorboat forum, a guy called Paul Street, he's known as Volvo Paul, was recommended. He came down to Portishead, had a look, and he put me onto a pair of Volvo TAN D61A engines that were in somebody's garage. And it was a guy that had been a journalist for Motorboat Monthly, and he had re-engined his pilot boat with a pair of new engines that he was doing a review on, and the old engines were literally just mothballed in his garage. So I went down to Romford, and they were, sure enough, they were sat on a pair of pallets in his garage, and I took copious amounts of photos so Paul could take a look and tell me whether they looked okay or not. Very difficult if you can't run an engine to see whether it's alright or not, but they seemed okay. They're a 1995 engine, and so I bought them. Okay, and we then trucked Dreamfinder up to Newark-on-Trent, which is an inland marina on the River Trent, close to where Paul lives. So it meant it was convenient for him to do the work. So we ended up grounding out the trailer and blocking the main road for a little while we got her into the marina. When we got her into the marina, they put her onto the hard standing, and then we started work. So to get the engines out, it's quite fortuitous that in the ceiling, in the floor of the flybridge, as it were, there is a hatch. So this, you can see the frame on the left hand side here, which is for the ceiling, which are it's ply with foam backing and then leatherette on it, so that those ceiling panels came down, took the frame out, and then I had to get rid of all of the Sikaflex and caulking around the hatch, and undo all of the screws, and then get the hatch out. Once we got the hatch out, we were then able to crane the engines out. So these are the old engines in the hoist, and we got them out. Just literally put them onto the ground out there. I managed to sell those engines. They were shipped off to, I believe it was Kenya, to be sort of rebuilt and reused over there. The reason why we decided to replace them rather than try and rebuild them is you can't get rebuild kits for that vintage of engine anymore, so we couldn't actually rebuild them. We had a bit of a dilemma at this point because the original engines were actually fitted at an angle, and the new engines had come out of a boat where they were horizontal, so the gearbox on those engines had an angle on the gearbox, whereas the old gearboxes were straight through. So we did a bit of research and looked at the old gearboxes and worked out that these gearboxes would actually be suitable and compatible with the new engines. So we separated the gearboxes. I sold the new gearboxes again, and we then started to sort of fit the new engines. Before we could fit the engines, though, I had to clean up that disaster of the exhaust elbow separating. So lots of pampers, lots of Silit Bang cleaning materials, and yeah, went to town. And once I'd finished cleaning it, we then repainted it, and it's looking a lot better. And then the engines could go in. So this is the starboard engine, just getting ready for being removed, and removing the draining the oil at this point. And here is the port engine, as it's been a bit seated. Okay, and this again is the port engine showing the rear of that. Now, the exhaust elbow that you see here, this elbow with the flexible hosing here turned out to be a bit of an issue, because when the engines are turned off, the raw water was actually running back into the turbo, and we ended up cracking the turbo housing over time, and that caused some problems. Thankfully, we caught it before we ran the engine, so we were able to replace the turbo and then put a water trap in to stop that from happening in the future. We replaced the Halon fire suppression system because they were empty anyway, so we put new fire suppression system in, and then once the engines were in and everything was ready, she was dropped into the River Trent so we could just check that the engines were running and all the propulsion was okay and everything like that. At this point, she still hasn't got the radar arch on there. So now the engines are in, the interior is still in a bit of a mess because we've had to strip out the saloon area, rip out the bench seating to actually lift the floor to get the engines in. So start putting the trim back on. So here's the start of putting in the ceiling. Okay, and as I said, they are marine ply foam backed with leatherette, so I replaced the leatherette, and while I was at it I also replaced the light fittings with something that looks a bit more modern and LED light fittings. While I was doing this, I decided I would actually change the trim as well. The boat is it's a blue and white trim, so I changed that for a chocolate and cream trim, and you can see on the right hand side here where there's some cream here, and it's a material that has been stuck on. So where the blue material was before is now this sort of creamy colour, and then the chocolate, and I think it goes really quite well. So I've retrimmed around the windows as well, and yeah, so I think it looks quite nice. What I haven't done is I haven't trimmed the port side, and I need to do that as part of this project just to finish that off. Just that little bit along the top there needs to be done. On the starboard side, behind where the bench seating was, there is actually a panel that comes out, and behind that panel is all of the wiring that is going to the rear of the boat, to the radar arch. Actually, when you pull that panel out, there is another panel hidden behind that has got the steering in it as well. And you can see on the left hand side this black vertical pipe, which is the heating. That's part of the Webasto system. On the port side of the boat, there's this nice sort of cabinet area. Again, it's starting to look a little bit dated, but it's still quite serviceable. This, where the television hole is, I think I'm going to turn that into a cupboard, because it's not really, we don't really watch television on the boat anyway, to be quite frank, and I don't think many people do. So the two cupboards on the left hand side, the one at an angle is where the 240 volt power is, and then the other sort of double cupboard there underneath that box is where the panel is for the 24 volt electrical system. So that's where you turn the batteries on, and it's also where the Webasto is. Rather than sort of carpet the steps at the back, we put in this wood panelling, which I think looks quite nice now it's been done. Unfortunately, that's probably going to have to come up as part of the replacement of the deck and then be redone. So again, something to watch out for. And you can see in the centre of the floor here is this sort of hatch that I've opened up for the engines. So the bench seating, you can see where the bench seating was on the right hand side there. So what we've done is we replaced the bench seating with a custom made sofa, okay, and it's an L-shaped sofa with a piece that sort of slots in that turns it into a double bed, and it's quite comfy, yeah, I think it looks quite nice. It goes with the decor very well, and as I say, it turns quite nicely into a double bed. It's very comfy to sleep on. So now that's done, we're ready to move. So Dreamfinder goes back onto a low loader and we head down to Southampton from Newark. Okay. She first arrived in Southampton onto the River Hamble, which is quite a popular destination and quite pricey, but she was placed above a road bridge, which meant that at high tides it was restricted access, so it made the marina quite a little bit cheaper and more affordable. Now she's down on the River Hamble, we're ready for sea trials. So we went out on sea trials, and it was a lovely day, and it was great to be back out on the water. And the sea was pretty much like glass. That's where the wheels came off, because in sea trials we got about 15-20 minutes into running the engines at a reasonable pace, and we dropped a valve on the port engine. Apparently these sort of engines were prone to it. So when I bought the engines, I actually made the decision to buy a full set of rebuild kits for them. And the idea was that because the engines were a 1995 engine and you could still get the rebuild kits, by the time I came to want to rebuild them, the rebuild kits would probably no longer be available. So we bought them basically to hold them for that purpose. So now we needed it. So we rebuilt both engines in situ. Okay, so they have had a complete top end rebuild, and now have around about 430 hours on them from the rebuild. So while all that was going on, I thought I would have a look at what was going on in that back cabin, and at the time it didn't look too bad. Okay, now I didn't know what I know now, because I hadn't actually watched any of these sort of YouTube videos or anything like that, and it was actually quite a dry season, so I didn't actually see many of the leaks anyway. And I replaced this panel here, okay, and then started to look at retrimming it. Now the trim again is a leatherette, and it was leatherette panels that had been sewed together and then stapled to the beams. So I started to redo that, and yeah, I painted everything with anti-mold paint as well. And you can see here the deck hatch, it's still leaking, but I sealed it with Sikaflex and what have you. Didn't really do a very good job at it, if I'm perfectly honest, knowing what I know now. But it actually started to look quite nice. You can see here we have the new material which is stuck onto the walls. Here is the old material, the blue, and you can see the lower half of that where it's faded quite badly, which is part of the reason why I wanted to replace it. Okay, yeah, so it started to come together, and yeah, once it was finished, I don't think it looked half bad. I mean, considering this is the first time I've used a sewing machine or done any of this sort of trimming, there was a little bit of bits and pieces that I wasn't overly happy with. But if you'd not visited the boat before and not lived with it, you wouldn't really have seen it. And I think it looks quite nice. Okay, so that's where we were, and that is now 7 years ago. So we're at a point now where we're going to be redoing all this cabin, and in my previous video I showed you where it is at the moment and the state of it. But before we redo the cabin, I must make sure that I sort out all those leaks. So the deck is coming off, etc. Well, I've just come off the phone with Glass and Dock, and we've got a bit of a problem there, because the sea lock is being closed until the end of March, and they're not accepting boats anyway due to lockdown. So we're on to plan B, but they've given me some ideas. So I think we're going to end up staying at Fleetwood, and if I renew my contract with Fleetwood, I get 3 months on hard standing included in that price. So I think that's what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to build a structure around the boat. I think probably the rear half of the boat. I don't think I'm going to have to need to cover the entire boat, but I'll see what you think. I'll do a little diagram now and show you what my ideas are in terms of how I'm going to make her weatherproof while we do this work. This is my idea for the waterproof covering for Dreamfinder while she's on hard standing. I've researched scaffolding and putting up a scaffolding tent, and it's going to cost £4,500 for 3 months to hire a tent that will cover her, which I think is a little bit prohibitive for what I'm wanting to do. So what I thought I would do is I would make a tent out of wood, so create this wooden frame as you see here, with an apex roof out of two frames, and then the sides, and then an end here that would just slot on. So the whole idea being that I would pre-cover that with tarpaulin, and I'm going to double staple it to the wooden frame, so that it is actually going to stay on in the wind. And then once the whole thing is lifted, then it should look something similar to that. Okay, now I do have precedence because I've actually built one of these things before, so essentially I know that I'm going to have to reinforce the corners, and I'm also going to have some form of a staple to to staple it to the ground. So I'm thinking about making these endpoints here longer so that they actually stick into the ground, and then having sort of like tent pegs around to hold it down to the ground. As I say, I have built one of these things before. This is a spray booth I built for a restoration project of an old Mercedes that I was doing up. So hopefully I think that will do what I need it to do. So that's it for this week's video, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a little bit restrictive with lockdown at the moment, so hopefully we can get up to the boat shortly and we can actually crack on with some of the projects. But if you like what you've seen so far, please hit the thumbs up, and please also look at hitting the subscribe button down below as well. Thank you.